a cut wire, a missing rifle, a dead sentry. In 1941, German commanders in Belgrade dismissed it as banditry. A problem for police, not a true army. They laughed. By 1944, that laughter was gone, replaced by the guns of 30 divisions, trapped and fighting for their lives against the army they never saw coming. June 28, 1941. Wehrmacht headquarters, Belgrade. The city outside is still a graveyard of shattered buildings and traumatized silence, a fresh wound left by the Luftwaffe's Operation Punishment just weeks earlier. The conquest of Yugoslavia was surgically fast. 11 days, the Royal Army had evaporated like morning fog. Now, this was occupation duty. Boring, hot, and beneath a man destined for the real war, the one currently roaring east into Russia, Oberleutnant Klinker's desk is covered in administrative reports. But mixed in, like grit in a machine, are the other reports, the ones from the Feldgendarmerie military police. He picks one up, a telephone line cut near Užice. A supply depot guard found with his throat cut, his K-98K rifle missing. A small convoy of trucks, ambushed on a mountain pass, were dead, one Landesschützen reservist wounded, and the perpetrators vanished. Klinker sighs and passes the file to his superior, a major who is fanning himself with his cap. The major glances at the title. Activity Report. Serb Banden. Bandits. He snorts, a small, dismissive sound. This is what they send us? The major scoffs, tapping the file. Police work. This isn't war. This is pest control. This was the consensus. From the highest offices in Berlin to the barracks in Belgrade, the view was identical. The Wehrmacht, the most powerful land army in human history, had just shattered France in 6 weeks and was currently tearing the Red Army to pieces. And now, they were supposed to worry about a few disorganized Slavs with hunting rifles and stolen potato mashers? General Franz Böhmer, the plenipotentiary commanding general in Serbia, had already laid out the solution. It was simple. It was brutal. It was, in his mind, efficient. For every German soldier wounded, 50 local civilians would be shot. For every German soldier killed, 100. In the staff meetings, they laughed. They called them communists, brigands, partisans, the word spat out like an insult. They were Untermenschen, subhumans, led by criminals and Bolshevik agents. This wasn't a front. It was a security problem. The men assigned to Bandenbekämpfung anti-bandit operations were often older reservists, second-rate troops from garrison divisions, or brutal SS Einsatzgruppen more suited to mass murder than a firefight. The real soldiers, the Panzergrenadiers, and the Fallschirmjäger were needed in Russia. This was Germany's first, and most fatal, miscalculation. They saw a disorganized rabble. They failed to see the men and women who, at that very moment, were gathering in the forests of the Šumadija region or the mountains of Montenegro. They were communists, yes, but they were also royalists. They were Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Muslims, and Jews. They were peasants, students, poets, and factory workers. And they were all united by a singular, burning hatred for the occupiers. The Germans saw bandits. They failed to see the man who was even now organizing these disparate groups into something new. A man who had fought in the Red Army, who had survived Stalin's purges, and who understood both ideology and ruthless guerrilla warfare. A Croat metalworker, a phantom known only by his Comintern code name, Tito. The Germans had set the policy, 1-0-0 to 1. They had put a price on their own heads, payable in the blood of the innocent. They thought this would terrorize the population into submission. Instead, they had just given a bandit army an unlimited supply of recruits, each one with nothing left to lose. The laughter in the Belgrade headquarters would not last long. The German policy of indiscriminate slaughter did not break the resistance. It was the resistance. It was the movement's single greatest recruitment tool. If your brother was shot for a cut telegraph wire, you went to the forest. If your village was burned because a German convoy was attacked 5 miles away, you went to the forest. If you were a Jew or a Romani facing certain annihilation, you went to the forest, and in the forest, you found them, partisani. At first, the German response was exactly what you'd expect: arrogant, localized, and brutal. They called it Säuberungsaktionen, cleansing actions. General Böhmer unleashed the 714th and 718th Infantry Division's garrison troops, not elite, but armed with artillery and machine guns. They would surround a valley, burn the villages, and shoot anyone they found. They called this pacification. But there was a problem. The partisans, under Tito's strict orders, refused to fight a conventional battle. They were a phantom army. They hit a patrol, took their rifles, and melted back into the wilderness, often indistinguishable from the very civilians the Germans were terrorizing. The German soldier, trained for the vast, open warfare of the Ostfront, was now lost. His tanks were useless on goat paths. His maps were blank, the trees had eyes, and the rocks exploded. The Wehrmacht was a hammer, and to them, this was a nail. But it wasn't. It was water. It was smoke. And while the Wehrmacht was chasing phantoms, Tito was doing something the Germans couldn't even comprehend. He wasn't just building a guerrilla force. He was building a state. While the Germans were focused on another group, the royalist Chetniks, led by Draža Mihailovića, man they believed might be a potential, if temporary, ally against the communist Tito's forces, seized a foothold. In the autumn of 1941, they liberated the town of Užice in western Serbia, and for 67 days, the Republic of Užice existed. It was the first liberated territory in all of occupied Europe. Think about that. While the Red Army was fighting for its life at the gates of Moscow, a bandit army had carved out a functional, independent state, right in the Wehrmacht's backyard. They had a government. They had popular councils. They had a post office. Most importantly, they had the Užice Oružara, an arms factory. They were making rifles, ammunition, and hand grenades. They were no longer just stealing weapons, they were manufacturing them. This was the moment the laughter in Belgrade stopped. This was no longer a bandit problem. This was an insurrection. This was an ideological and military cancer. The Germans had dismissed them as an inferior, unorganized rabble. And that rabble had just drawn a border on the map and dared the Reich to cross it. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in Berlin, was enraged. He demanded the rebellion be drowned in blood. The response was immediate, and it was massive. They were done with pest control. This was now war. They called it Operation Užice. Operation Užice, launched in November 1941, marked the first true commitment of significant German military might against Tito's partisans. No longer were they relying solely on garrison troops and punitive actions. This was a combined arms offensive. The 342nd Infantry Division, fresh from occupation duties, and elements of the 113th Infantry Division, usually deployed for the Eastern Front, were redeployed to Yugoslavia. They brought with them artillery, light armor, and the ruthless efficiency of the Wehrmacht. Their objective: destroy the Republic of Užice and annihilate Tito's main operational group. The Germans, however, were not the only enemy. Inside Yugoslavia, a brutal civil war was already raging. Draža Mihailović's Chetniks, Serbian royalists and nationalists, initially saw the Germans as the primary enemy, but their greater hatred was for Tito's communists. They saw the partisans as a threat to their vision of a restored Serbian monarchy, an ideological poison even more dangerous than the occupation. There were attempts at cooperation, famously at the small town of Brajici in October 1941, where Tito and Mihailović met face to face. But their goals were diametrically opposed. Mihailović advocated for waiting, preserving forces, and striking only when the Western Allies landed. Tito demanded immediate, aggressive action against the occupiers. They parted ways as rivals, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for Yugoslavia. As the German offensive pressed in, the Chetniks, instead of fighting the occupiers, turned their guns on the partisans. Betrayed by their countrymen, outnumbered and outgunned, the partisans fought desperately. They were not yet the disciplined army they would become. Many were green recruits, barely trained. The Užice factory, once a symbol of their defiance, became a target. Tito understood that to survive, they could not stand and fight conventionally. The Wehrmacht's overwhelming firepower would crush them. His order was clear: tactical retreat. They evacuated Užice, destroying as much as they could, carrying their makeshift factory equipment with them. It was a brutal, forced march in the bitter cold, over snow-covered mountains. Many perished. The Germans considered Operation Užice a resounding success. They had recaptured the territory, inflicted heavy casualties, and dispersed Tito's main force. They believed they had effectively destroyed the partisan movement. General Böhm reported to Berlin that the bandit problem was solved. They underestimated Tito again. They saw a defeated, scattered force. They failed to see the hardened core that remained, tempered by the inferno of the first major offensive. These were not the green recruits who had started the fight. These were survivors, committed to Tito's vision, and now, even more cunning and ruthless in their guerrilla tactics. The retreat from Užice was not an end, it was a baptism of fire. The partisans had learned invaluable lessons about German tactics, about the necessity of mobility, and about the terrible price of conventional warfare. They were now heading south, into the rugged, untamed mountains of Bosnia and Montenegro, a land that would become their sanctuary and their greatest weapon. The Germans had won the battle. But by forcing Tito's hand, they had inadvertently forged the very weapon that would bleed them dry for years to come. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was a crucible. After the fall of Užice, Tito's remaining forces, numbering around 4,000 battle-hardened fighters, undertook the arduous, long march through the freezing mountains. They were pursued not only by the Germans and the fascist Ustaš regime of Croatia, but also by Mihailović's Chetniks. This wasn't merely survival, it was a deliberate act of strategic repositioning. Tito established his new headquarters in Foča, a small town in eastern Bosnia. It was here, during this brutal winter, that he would truly begin to transform his guerrilla bands into a disciplined, ideological army, the Narodno-slobodilačka vojska Jugoslavije, the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia. He understood that purely localized banditry, while effective for harassment, would never achieve liberation. He needed a unified command structure, political commissars, to ensure ideological purity and morale, and a strict code of conduct that differentiated his partisans from the indiscriminate brutality of the Chetniks and the occupiers. Under Tito's direction, the partisans began to gain the trust of the local population, especially the diverse peoples of Bosnia, who had suffered under the Ustaš and Chetnik ethnic cleansing campaigns. Unlike other factions, Tito's movement was multinational, embracing Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others, promising a future Yugoslavia free from ethnic strife. This broad appeal, combined with their unwavering commitment to fighting the occupiers, saw their ranks swell. The Germans, meanwhile, were facing increasing headaches. The Balkans were supposed to be pacified, a secure source of raw materials, especially bauxite, vital for their aircraft industries, and a safe transit route for supplies to Greece and North Africa. Instead, they were bleeding. Every convoy required heavy escort, every bridge had to be guarded, every vital mine or factory became a fortress. The cost in manpower, fuel, and equipment was astronomical. They had to redeploy precious divisions, stripping units from more vital fronts. In early 1942, the Germans launched what became known as the Second Anti-Partisan Offensive, specifically targeting Tito's forces in eastern Bosnia. They called it Operation Southeast Croatia, or sometimes Operation Ozren. Once again, it was a massive undertaking, involving German units, Italian forces, Ustasha militia, and even collaborating Chetniks. The German plan was to encircle and destroy the partisans in their mountain strongholds. But Tito's partisans were no longer a disorganized rabble. They had learned from Užice. They moved with speed and cunning, slipping through encirclement lines, striking at the weakest points, and vanishing back into the impenetrable terrain they knew intimately. They inflicted punishing casualties on the Axis forces, often surprising them with audacious attacks. The Battle of Igman, a desperate winter march of the 1st Proletarian Brigade, where they literally froze their boots off to escape an encirclement, became a legendary feat of endurance and defiance. The Germans believed they had pacified eastern Bosnia. But while they claimed victory, Tito's main force had once again escaped, bloodied but unbowed, and now even more determined. They had successfully evacuated thousands of wounded, and their ranks were growing with new recruits, who saw in the Partisans the only force truly fighting for Yugoslavia. The Axis forces were repeatedly claiming victory, but the bandit problem only grew larger, more organized, and more lethal. What the German commanders were starting to realize, to their growing horror, was that every victory only succeeded in forging a more resilient and dangerous enemy. By late 1942, the German High Command could no longer lie to itself. This was not a bandit problem. Tito's forces had swelled to over 150,000 men and women under arms. They had liberated a massive swathe of territory in western Bosnia and Croatia, centered on the town of Bihać. They called it the Bihać Republic. They had their own government, the AVNOJ. They had field hospitals. They had workshops. They had an air force, consisting of a few captured Ustash planes. They were a state operating in the heart of the Reich's strategic rear, sitting directly astride the Wehrmacht's most critical supply lines to the Mediterranean. This was an existential threat. With the disaster at Stalingrad unfolding in the east and the Allies landing in North Africa, the last thing Hitler needed was a full-blown army rising up in his backyard. He ordered it crushed, permanently. The man assigned to do this was Generaloberst Alexander Löhr, the Wehrmacht commander-in-chief for Southeast Europe. Löhr was no garrison commander. He was the man who had commanded Luftflotte 4 inches the bombing of Belgrade. He understood the scale of the threat. Löhr assembled one of the largest anti-guerrilla forces in modern history for a new operation, Fall Weiss, or Case White. This was the 4th anti-partisan offensive. It wasn't just a cleansing action. It was a war of annihilation. Over 90,000 elite Axis soldiers, supported by armor and the full might of the Luftwaffe, began a massive, concentric encirclement in January 1943. Their goal was simple: trap Tito's main operational group, along with its 4,000 wounded and typhus-stricken fighters, against the icy Neretva River, and slaughter them all. For the Partisans, this was the ultimate test. They were slow, burdened by their wounded, whom Tito categorically refused to abandon. The Partisan code was, "The wounded must not fall into the hands of the enemy." By early March 1943, the trap was sprung. The Partisans were pinned in the Neretva Valley. All bridges were down. On the far bank, 20,000 Chetniks, supplied by the Italians, waited to finish them off. Behind them, the German divisions were closing in, squeezing the pocket. Defeat seemed inevitable. It was here that Tito conceived one of the most audacious deceptions of the Second World War. He gave a shocking order: destroy the last remaining bridge across the Neretva, the one at Jablanica. His commanders were stunned. This was suicide. But Tito knew his enemy. He knew the Germans were methodical. He ordered his engineers to make a great show of blowing the bridge, signaling a desperate, suicidal attempt to break out north, back towards the main German force. General-Lieutenant Rudolf Lüters, the German commander, took the bait perfectly. Convinced Tito was making a desperate charge north, Lüters ordered his main force to reposition, to block this mad escape. He left the unpassable river and the Chetniks on the other side to clean up any survivors. The Germans had moved. The trap was now misaligned. And in the dead of night, as the Luftwaffe was grounded by a blizzard, Tito gave his real order. For 24 hours, the entire Partisan main group, healthy, the sick, and the 4,000 wounded began to cross the river, one by one, in silence. Once across, they did not flee. They attacked. They fell upon the waiting Chetnik divisions with absolute fury. The Chetniks, caught completely by surprise, collapsed. The Battle of the Neretva, as it came to be known, was a total disaster for Mihailovich's forces, shattering them as a viable fighting force. When General Luthers realized what had happened, that Tito had fainted, built a new bridge, and crossed an impassable river with 4,000 wounded under his nose, he was apoplectic. The partisans had escaped. They had saved their wounded, and they had proven to the Germans that they were not just a rabble. They were a brilliant, unorthodox, and utterly indomitable army. But the worst was yet to come. The escape at Neretva was more than a failure. It was a humiliation. In Berlin, Hitler was incandescent. The Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Italians had all been outwitted by a bandit leader. The entire German strategy in the Balkans was at risk. If the Allies invaded Italy, which now seemed inevitable, Tito's army would be a strategic dagger aimed at the Reich's soft underbelly. There would be no more complex maneuvering. There would be no more gaps to slip through. The order for Fall Schwarz, case black, was simple: extermination. General Oberst was given carte blanche. This would be the fifth anti-partisan offensive, and it would be the last. He didn't just reassemble his forces, he escalated. In May 1943, just 2 months after Neretva, over 120,000 of the Reich's best soldiers, supported by 300 aircraft, began to move. Their target, Tito's main operational group, now numbering around 22,000 fighters, exhausted, hungry, and still protecting over 4,000 wounded. The partisans were trapped in the brutal, limestone wilderness of northern Montenegro, near the Durmitor Massif. This was terrain from a nightmare maze of sheer canyons and impassable rivers. And this time, the Germans were not just pushing from behind, they were ahead. Using their elite mountain troops, the Germans had preemptively seized every mountain pass, every bridge, every ford. They had created a perfect, hermetic seal of steel. They called it the Kesselschlachter Cauldron battle. The partisans were surrounded, completely. The noose tightened. This was no longer a guerrilla war. It was a siege. Starving, suffering from a fresh outbreak of typhus, and with ammunition running dangerously low, the partisans were forced into a conventional, set-piece battle they could not win. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. Stuka dive bombers hunted the partisan columns relentlessly, their sirens a constant, screaming requiem. The German artillery, ranged in on the valley, rained down a perpetual storm of high explosives. The Battle of the Sutjeska was hell made real. The partisans were dying in their thousands. The German commanders were certain of victory. They reported that Tito's forces were in the last throes of death. On June 9th, 1943, at the height of the battle, a German bomb found Tito's command post. The explosion killed his military attaché, Captain Bill Deakinther, head of the British military mission, and Tito's beloved Alsatian dog, Lux, who reportedly threw himself on his master. Tito himself was badly wounded, a large piece of shrapnel in his arm. At this darkest moment, with the noose at its tightest, Tito made a desperate, almost suicidal decision. He identified a single, narrow point in the German linear ridge held by the 118th Jaeger Division across the Sutjeska River. He ordered his 1st Proletarian Brigade to attack it, straight up the hill, with everything they had left. He split his forces. He and the main, healthy force would punch a hole. The 4,000 wounded, guarded by the 2nd Dalmatian Brigade, would have to try and break out elsewhere. It was a horrific, necessary choice. They broke through. Tito, the government, and the 1st Proletarian Brigade, heart of the partisan army, slipped through the gap before the Germans could slam it shut. But the price was unimaginable. Over 7,500 partisans were killed, a full third of their main force. The 4,000 wounded, left behind, were systematically hunted down and executed by the Prinz Eugen SS Division in one of the war's most brutal massacres. The Germans had won a staggering tactical victory. They had annihilated half the partisan army, but they had failed. They had failed to kill Tito. They had failed to destroy the command structure. The bandit army had just faced 5 of the most elite divisions in the Wehrmacht in a conventional battle, and had not only survived, they had broken out. For the German commanders who had laughed in Belgrade, the realization was chilling. This enemy could not be broken. In Berlin, General Oberst reported the successful conclusion of Fall Schwarz. He claimed the destruction of Tito's main force. The German propaganda machine spun it as a triumph, a final end to the communist bandit threat. It was, perhaps, the single greatest act of self-deception the Wehrmacht committed in the Balkans. They had killed thousands. They had retaken every town and river valley, but they had failed to kill the idea. And they had failed to kill the man who embodied it. From the wreckage of Sutjeska, two things emerged. First, Tito's surviving force, now unbound and more furious than ever, fanned out and began a campaign of recruitment and retribution that was staggering in its speed. The story of their martyrs' battle and impossible breakout was a more powerful recruitment tool than any pamphlet. But the second, and more decisive, outcome was happening thousands of miles away. The British, for 2 years, had been backing the royalist Chetniks. They believed Mihailovich was their man, but Dakin's reports, sent from the heart of the inferno, told an undeniable truth. The Chetniks were not just inactive, they were collaborators, openly fighting with the Axis against the Partisans. The Partisans and only the Partisans were killing Germans. This report, combined with intelligence from the new head of the British mission, Brigadier Fitzroy Maclean, landed on Winston Churchill's desk like a grenade. At the Tehran conference, the Big Three made their decision. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation of war. Mihailovich was a liability. Tito was an asset. The Allies formally recognized the Partisans as the official Allied army in Yugoslavia. All future support weapons, ammunition, uniforms, medicine, and air support would be directed to Tito. The bandit army was now, in the eyes of the world, the fourth Allied power. For the Germans, this was the ultimate nightmare. It was as if a rabble of peasants had suddenly been promoted to the rank of a regular army, with the industrial might of the United States and Great Britain as its quartermaster. The impact was immediate. The Partisans, once armed with a motley collection of captured rifles, were now receiving British Sten guns, American bazookas, and radio equipment. Their wounded were being evacuated to Allied hospitals in Italy. They were no longer just a guerrilla force, they were becoming a modern, conventional army. And Germany's response? It was the only one they had left: escalation. This is the number that German commanders, in their post-war memoirs, could never reconcile. This is the truth behind the laughter in that Belgrade headquarters. By late 1943, to contain this single bandit army, the German High Command was forced to commit, or hold in reserve, a force that was utterly staggering. In total, the Axis forces tied down in Yugoslavia numbered over 30 divisions. That is over 600,000 men. Think of it. 600,000 troops who were desperately needed to fight the Red Army at Kursk. 600,000 troops who were needed to stop the Allied landings at Anzio in Italy. 600,000 troops who would be desperately missed when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were all here, stuck in the mountains, hunting a ghost, bleeding to death in 1,000 small ambushes, fighting for useless bridges and impassable mountain passes, all because they had laughed at a bandit problem. The German High Command was now desperate. Their bandit problem was tying down an army group. Their arrogance had cost them a strategic front. Field Marshal Maximilian von Weich, the new Commander-in-Chief Southeast, had to admit a truth that would have been laughable in 1941. The partisan army was too large to be defeated conventionally. So, they turned to a new, desperate plan. If you cannot destroy the body, you cut off the head. They called it Operation Russell Sprung the Knight's Move. It was not an offensive, it was an assassination. The target, Josip Broz Tito himself. German intelligence had pinpointed his headquarters in a network of caves above the town of Dochtvar. The plan was a daring, two-pronged SS operation. First, a heavy aerial bombardment. Second, the SS Fallschirmjäger, Bataillon 500, a penal unit of elite, ruthless commandos would drop directly onto the headquarters, while ground forces of the 7th SS Prinz Eugen closed the ring. The assault was a complete shock. The first wave of paratroopers landed, by glider and parachute, almost on top of Tito's cave. They were not met by a partisan arm, which was out in the field, but by Tito's personal guard, his staff, and, crucially, a group of young cadets from a nearby officer training school. What followed was not a battle. It was a brawl. The German commandos, believing they were fighting a rabble, charged the cave entrance. They were met with a suicidal wall of resistance. The fighting was for yards, then feet. The SS commandos were stunned by the ferocity of the inferior Slavs. Inside the cave, Tito and his staff were trapped. The Germans were just 100 meters from the entrance. This should have been the end. But Tito was not a general who commanded from the rear. He was a guerrilla. His staff lowered him down a sheer cliff face at the back of the cave system, using a rope reportedly made of signal wire and knotted clothing. He escaped. By the time the SS commandos finally fought their way into the cave, they found only his abandoned marshal's uniform, freshly delivered by his tailor, and a half-eaten breakfast. They had captured his clothes, but not the man. Operation Russelsprung was the single most embarrassing failure of the German war in Yugoslavia. It was their last gasp. They had thrown their most elite commandos at a single man, and he had slipped through their fingers, just as his army had slipped through their encirclements time and time again. From this moment, the German war in Yugoslavia changed. It was no longer about pacification. It was about survival. The laughter in Belgrade in 1941 had turned to sheer panic. The bandit army, now numbering nearly 500,000 strong, armed by the Allies and supported by their air forces, was no longer a guerrilla movement. It was a steamroller. In October 1944, Tito's partisans, fighting side by side with the advancing Soviet Red Army, stormed the city where it all began. The Belgrade offensive was the final, bloody vindication. The rabble had returned, not as bandits, but as liberators. The German commanders, who had viewed the partisans as a bandit problem, were now leading the shattered remnants of WWII in a desperate, frantic retreat, trying to escape the very country they had once conquered in 11 days. They were being hunted, every step of the way, by the army they had laughed at.